reading works that were written a long time ago, which might be problematic for us now, or writing works that are set long ago, which both reflect the time period in which they are set, but will not cause undue distress or confusion to readers. So I'm thinking that those are two situations that are very closely aligned, and then in my view, as we can probably at least address both issues. But first, I would like to have the panel introduce themselves and to say a little bit about why they're interested in this panel.
Yeah, my name is Jacob Weisman. I am the publisher of Tachyon Publications, a specialty science fiction and fantasy press out of San Francisco. So we've published a number of books over the years. The one most germane to this topic would be The Treasury of the Fantastic, which I edited with David Sandner, an academic at Cal State Fullerton many years ago, which was an attempt to make a definitive anthology of Weird Tales fantasy fiction, and that goes back to the Romantic poets. But, you know, there's also something we can talk about later.
First of all, does this work? Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay. My name is Michael Dirda. I review books for the Washington Post and other places. I'm on this panel because I'm interested in works of the past. I believe that there is often a tendency among younger writers of today to neglect the great works of the past, which provide templates and blueprints for a lot of things we do today, and so that it's essential that they be preserved. As Ezra Pound said, the past was a beauty we preserve, not a set of fetters to bind us, and I believe that's true.
I'm Catherynne Valente. I'm one of the guests on it. I've written a number of science fiction and fantasy books for both children and adults, including Radiant, Deathless, and the Fairyland series. I write a lot of historical fiction. I don't know why. It's so much more work. I don't know why I keep doing this myself. But so I'm intensely interested in these ideas of how to access the past and tell some kind of truth about it without losing the things that we value today.
Hello, I'm Phenderson Clark. I'm a writer as well as a professor of history. And so I am intimately interested in how speculative fiction looks at the past and tries to reinterpret it and draws on the past in order to speak about often the present.
So when you were doing research for the books that you were writing, and when you are reading some of the classics, we frequently find that we trip over things, attitudes, words, assumptions that are beginning to change now, that we trip over them and we find that they bring us out of the narrative. How do you deal with that when you hit something that really shows you how things have become unacceptable that used to be more than acceptable, that were central to a culture again?
Well, let's jump in. Do you want to go in order or anything like that, or so we just jump in?
Yeah.
I'll
I'll wrangle you if you need it.
It seems to me, in some ways, you can argue that those things that trip us up are the reason we read, that we should look for them. They are actually offering us challenges to think about the books, think about the present, to question our preconceptions, note how things have changed. That these are among the values of reading books of the past because they are very different from today. Sometimes they can be things that we find objectionable, in which case they provide things to think about and how the world has changed. Or sometimes they might, as I say, just ask us to rethink the things that we believe. Maybe they have something to still say to us, even though they seem alien to modern sensibilities.
Well, I think it's usually the bigger things that trip us up. I think, there's a lot of little stuff that you don't quite understand, like, what is that? Is that some sort of bow tie, or what am I trying to visualize? But I think the bigger things are worldview, whether it's religious worldview, things that you're expected to bring to the text that you don't know. I know a lot of college professors who lament that their students don't remember the Cold War, and that informs so much of science fiction. When you go back and you read Childhood's End, the book is now very, very dated, because the first section of the book is all about how we're going to go from the Cold War to a point where we will actually be able to be elevated by when the aliens come to the next level of enlightenment. And we're now in that history and not there. Things did not progress the way they do in Clark's book. The Cold War is over, and we still haven't worked anything out. We're not ready for the aliens to come. And you read the beginning of it, and if you're coming to it, as a young person now, I think you just won't get that part of it. The rest of it, absolutely.
My next book for kids is about the Brontes as children. Some of you may or may not know that the Brontes, when they were kids, wrote this whole fantasy universe together, much as geeky kids do now. It was kind of like a low-tech MMO. And it's full of this sort of child's impression of the Napoleonic Wars, British politics, and Yorkshire fairy tales, and things that they found in their father's basically equivalent of National Geographic. There are parts of it that are pretty racist, and it's the strangest, most benign child's racism in that they have no idea what Africa is. All they have seen is like paintings of it in National Geographic. And they're obsessed with it. And to them, it's the most exotic thing in the world. Every magical thing must be in Africa. And it's a very weird microcosm, actually, of sort of the white impressions of Africa during certain periods of the world. It was absolutely not benign. And one of the challenges in writing the book is definitely to be true to what they created without reproducing the really harmful assumptions that they could not possibly have escaped, being lower middle class in Yorkshire. And on the other end, sort of non-political side of that, the book takes place in 1828, and what I discovered in myself is just how much our impressions of the 19th century are informed by like 1850 to 1870. Like that is sort of what we think of as the 19th century. So I caught myself up thinking of trains as in, oh, well, obviously trains, blah, 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 blah. Oh, no, not in 1828. In fact, the Yorkshire line had just been established and was just for commercial use. Trains were terrifying and brand new, and as horrifying a technology to a lot of people as nuclear bombs. And so I had to go through and change the emotional responses to this technology, because our idea of what the Victorian age was is so informed by the middle class of the mid-19th century.
No, I'm just thinking what you're saying is absolutely true when we look at epics in history and we're trying to interpret them. I feel like I'm repeating myself. Somebody told me on the last panel talking about ideas of, we're talking about historical figures, and here we're often talking about our own pragmatism within history, how we attempt to interpret the past through what we understand in this period. And we often have to make certain, that, as you said, looking at certain periods, our ideas of the 19th century, like I always tell students, it wasn't like people were like, hey, wow, like I was doing the Renaissance. They didn't say, hey, everybody, it's Renaissance. It's time. This is happening. And then when it ended, it just ended, right? So they all knew it. And so I said, we have these interesting demarcations between, 19th and 20th century, as if there was this like big line to cross over this wall, and like here we are in the 20th century, and everything's absolutely different than it just was, right? And so I think sometimes the ways in which we learn history in those blocks or sometimes overgeneralization something like, talking about the 19th century, where if you're in the United States, our 19th century is often very Civil War-ish, for instance. That's our interest in the 19th century and a bit of the industrial era, but we don't spend too much time on earlier periods, right? Or we may sometimes conflate that with later periods. So I think when you're looking at any type of history and research, you simply have to really get into the weeds and walk away from some of your conceptions, your preconceptions about what you expect to find.
I mean, I think it's interesting to say about the Civil War, because one of the things I have discovered living in as many parts of America as I have is how regional history is. Because, yes, you may have learned a lot about the American Revolution if you went to school in Boston. You may have learned a lot about the Civil War living on the East Coast. I went to school in Seattle and in California. The only things that ever happened in American history are the Oregon Trail and the Gold Rush. That's it. That's all that matters. Like, everything else you sort of rushed through to get to it.
I'm from Ohio, nothing of that.
I'm still waiting for your
Except for the Cavaliers this year.
Well, I'm just curious, what draws you to a particular age or subject? Is it the history that gets you first, or a thought about the history? How do you triangulate in your reading, what's the seed for a historical novel with you? If you're a writer, or what draws you as a reader if you're reviewing in a text?
I mean, I'm not a novelist or a short story writer, I just write about books.
Yeah.
But I'm drawn to cultures and periods that are different from our own, simply because they are different. Because I think one of the functions of reading is to enlarge our scope, our understanding of people and the world, and the only way you do that is to get outside your little box that you live in of the present and of the culture that you've grown up in, and find out about the rest of the world. Which is why I also, though I love science fiction and fantasy, I'm always urging people to read outside of that. And we talk about historical fiction. There's long been an analogy between historical fiction, which is the creation of past worlds and creations of alien worlds, and science fiction they both require a lot of work. So there are parallels, but just that the world of literature is so much larger than we sometimes think it if we're focused only on genre, and we miss out on a lot. So I think that just going outside of the present and of the zone you're living in is worthwhile. It allows you to grow as a reader, human being.
There's also an historical aspect. I mean, if you like modern fantasy, you go back and you read Tolkien. And then, Tolkien's influences are, Lord Dunsany and a bunch of other people, and they have influences. And if you go back, you can go back at every step in literature, and there are antecedents. The Renaissance writers, loved the Roman and the Greek authors, and so you can take literature back as far as you want to go. And, it's fascinating to see, the roots of the writers that you read now.
Well, I think that's really important. I mean, that you read the early literature because it does provide so many of the blueprints and templates and models for what comes later. If any of you read Ezra Pound's ABC of Reading, he's always urging you to read the first examples of the various kinds of poetry because they often contain the seeds of everything else that comes later. If you don't know the story of Ulysses, he keeps appearing in world literature, in Dante, and Phenderson, and Joyce, and Kazantzakis, and these books won't make any sense if you don't kind of know the Odyssey. So you need to go back in the past just to get yourself grounded.
So as readers, what you're interested in is the dialogue between the original literature and the more modern stuff that responds to it and deals with it, right?
Yeah.
So as writers, how do you deal with that dialogue? How do you enter that dialogue?
Well, I guess for me there's sort of three doors in. One of them is
Or number 2.
One of them is the glimpses of modernity, I find. Like, I love that the Bronte children basically were the same as the kids writing these elaborate fanfics that all interlink together. Seeing that, I mean, culture is different. People are people, and in some ways people never change since the conception of human civilization. And I love finding those little bits of commonality. I love seeing the ways in which we are just like the people of the past. Another one is when the real world has seemed fantastical. One of the roots of magical realism is how totalitarian governments alter language and culture in these sort of quasi-magical ways, where words don't mean the same thing as they used to. And just uttering the word can make a person disappear. And so when I find these ways in which humans have constructed their lives as though they are already in a novel, that also really grabs me. And the not too serious one is that modern technology straight ruins a lot of the stories we tell in fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And so I think that there's a lot more recent historical fiction being written these days, because without the internet and the cell phone, you have a little more freedom in getting people lost and, and getting them in situations that they can't get out of.
I mean, when I'm thinking of the type of things that I'm drawn to when I'm trying to write, I suppose I'm often interested in, when I look at history, to look at the histories that might be a bit more ignored or silenced. So I'm often looking to reconstruct voices that may not have had voices, like writing about a slave in Columbia or something in Hartley in the 18th century. And so I'm really interested in that aspect. And I like to see, I think where there's similarity there, it's a way in which historians, we could say historical fiction, might kind of bridge it when you're often speaking about those people who didn't have the great voices, who no one sat down and listened to their tales. So you have to be very inventive to get behind what the feelings were, what the motives were, what they might have said. And so there's a similarity there, I think, in what we do in speculative fiction, historical fiction, and what historians sometimes have to do reconstructing the fact.
Well, and I think that that's part of the glimpse of modernity. I mean, when you find somebody, because history is so overwhelmingly male and hegemonic, whether that hegemony is white and Western or not, when you glimpse somebody who's like you, and that story is not one that you were taught in school while everyone was talking about the gold rush, and they were talking about the colonial women in the lower classes and how they function in life, how it's more going on around them. Like, that sort of wakes something. And I'm always looking for those people who didn't have the camera on them.
As both a writer and a reader, I've always been much more interested in the history that people happened to, rather than the people who made the history that was happening to them. Because it seems to me that mostly we are the people that history is happening to, and we don't quite understand what's going on in their own view, and we have to make sense of it. So if they did too, that's one of the great things we've got. So that's really interesting.
And it's one of the things I love about reading historians, like reading narrative nonfiction, reading these histories, is because it's so, you only have to read a few before it's so blatant what the angle of the author is, and that provides that intersection between modern thought and ancient thought that we're talking about. I'm reading Alison Weir's biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine right now, and she spends 5 pages saying Eleanor was completely unique, there's no precedent for her, there's nothing like her, like her situation was so rarefied that you can't draw any conclusions about women in that era from the life that she led. And then starts talking about the mothers, grandmothers, the grandmothers, and great-grandmothers of Eleanor of Aquitaine, all of whom seem to be completely amazing. And so, like she has this whole thing about how, don't draw any feminist conclusions, and yet, the Eleanor of Aquitaine's grandmother, was named Rosa, for one thing, and was involved in this women's commune. It was a monastery, a mixed gender monastery run by an atlas because this guy thought that women were better at running things than men. And it's this like separatist commune in northern France. Okay, so Eleanor of Aquitaine is unique and there's no precedent for her. Well, there is, and she's about to share it, but like, I love that sort of interplay of can't mistake the actual history, but definitely want to impose modern ideas on it.
Have you ever read a text that you found sufficiently troubling that it was difficult for you to get through it, or
Almost certainly.
is there something that leads to mind?
Well, I mean, my 17th century English literature and philosophy class had a few of those, and it usually the stumbling block was usually religion, just being expected to know and subscribe to a number of beliefs that aren't actually in the text directly. It is rough, and and in that class we had to basically, you had to decode everything by learning the history so that you could read the text, and it was not terribly enjoyable. Every once in a while, there
Give you an example.
well, I mean, not exactly, but
So you do things like anti-Semitic?
well, then you run across that and something like Erasmus or something. Of course, we need to burn the Jews, or that was that's very easy to decode. That's not hard. It's like, oh, well, that's not good. I don't like that, but I understand what he's trying to say. But there are other things. It's like when you look at Renaissance painting, and it's like, well, the woman is holding an egg with a cross on top, and you're supposed to know what that symbolizes. But if you're a modern person, you haven't taken the right classes, you have no idea.
Well, we're talking about two different kinds of courage. There's difficult and there's repellent.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes reading a historical text, you run across both problems. But that frequently the more difficult one to deal with is the emotional.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think there are, most texts have a lot of texts have that as a subtext, without it being necessarily overt. When it is overt, it can be very repellent.
I think it always is a question of degree. If you're willing to grant a certain amount of historical context, is when they kind of exceed the historical context that becomes really repellent. Because otherwise, if you start, objecting to a lot of things in books, you find there's always going to be something repellent. Now, if you're a Catholic, you find all these references to the Whore of Babylon and papists. If you're a Jew or if you're black, the world of literature is filled with prejudices. And if you start, whipping everybody, you'll never stop. So it's only when things seemingly, where that line is drawn, so it's going to vary from person to person, and it depends on your background, it depends on all sorts of factors. But things crop up in literature all the time.
It is important to recognize that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you grant authors their givens and try to understand where they're coming from. And you can then judge that, whether it's sufficiently important to you get reward from it through the text anyway, if you allow it. T.S. Eliot is a great poet. If you're Jewish, he's made anti-Semitic remarks. Are they enough to render everything else irrelevant? Well, probably for most people, no. But for some people, they might. So you have to find out for yourself where you think the line should be drawn.
I mean, I'm not really sure how much mental energy I need to expend to understand where someone who says we need to burn the Jews is coming from. What they're coming from is that they're the worst. I understand.
But usually it's not. Usually things are never that overt.
But I'm a woman, so they are. the history
Were
of...
the women?
Yeah, among other things, but more often rape all the women. Like, the thing is, I'm a classicist. If I couldn't read historical texts and sort of put aside how horrific they are when it comes to women and anyone who doesn't fit in the local culture, then I could never have finished my degree. But at the same time, it's kind of a pernicious idea, the whole, well, it's in the past, so they couldn't help themselves, so they shouldn't be blamed for having terrible ideas in the past. It's kind of bullshit, because you can look at any period in the past and find people who didn't think that. It was possible to not think terrible things about your fellow human beings at any point in history. And so it's it is increasingly difficult for me to just excuse anybody because they were, born earlier than I was. And nowadays we're supposed to excuse people who were born in the 50s. That's entirely...
Well, so are there classics from the past that you can't read that you object to because they are too offensive to you?
So the ones that come immediately to mind are nonfiction, actually. Autobiography, I just makes me sick to my stomach. But...
I'm talking about literature.
Sure.
Well, there's the essay by Charles Deary, who's the African writer, who took on Conrad and had and basically through an essay that he's written, kind of proves beyond a shadow of a doubt not only that Conrad was racist, but that his racism informs, his work. And then, the question becomes, at what point, can we allow that into the canon of literature if there is this inherent flaw that's in the work? I mean, there are people who are racist and all kinds of things, but it doesn't necessarily enter their work. There's private statements and stuff, but there are these different degrees.
Okay, I agree with that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's getting kind of good. I was listening.
Yeah. Heat up a little bit, which is always good.
It's like I was actually picking up to sleep over here. So,
Conrad, don't read
I should say that my historical study is, I study slavery and emancipation. So, you want to talk about things that I read that are terrible? A lot of it's terrible. Lots of it is terrible. It's so terrible that, I tend to read it, and I have friends, family, who will say, I'll read the section, they'll say, you can stop. I don't want to hear anymore, right? And sometimes people think I'm desensitized to it because I can't read it. I say, no, it's not that. I think what you were saying, I have to do this in order to get to the work that I need. But, when you're dealing with the past, I like what you're saying, that not everyone in the past, whatever we have these notions of, quote-unquote, people were men of their times. I always remind people that the people on the receiving end or whatever was really bad were also people of that time. They weren't also okay. So, but on the other hand, everyone has you were asking what's difficult. It's all difficult, but everyone has what they can take, right? And so I'm able to read certain things that others will not. And does it impact me? Yeah, sometimes I read some things and I have to walk away from it because it is so.
Are we talking about history or are we talking about literature?
I don't know how you divide it. Because these are.
He's going to figure it out.
No, I really do. I think that's a good question in a sense, but we're often trying to, for me, I'm talking about sometimes reading. It's like what we decide is literature. I'm talking about sometimes reading literature, but I'm also talking about to me, part of talking about reading the past is also reading primary documents from the past, people's personal things. I can books on pro-slavery. There's an entire literature of pro-slavery text, right? That's a great part of writing, is persuasive writing on why slavery should happen. I'm just talking about my own historical research, and things in there are, we would pretty much think they're pretty repellent, right? Because the things you have to put forth. And these were very popularized at the time, sold in papers, and people added to them and traded them and what have you. And so all of that to me is, I see what you're saying in a literary sense, all of this literature, to me, is part of the task, whether it's something that's writing fictional literature or whether it is the historical text in the past.
Okay, let me answer your previous question. I kind of see what you're trying to thread here. I will say, it's not like I get sick to my stomach or I cry. I actually think a fairly important progression of me from a young person to an older person was I stopped being upset and I started getting angry. So, sure, let's take the most obvious thing. The end of Taming of the Shrew pisses me off. Like, every time I see it or read it, and the thing is that play is actually really integral to a lot of different things in culture, and it roots a lot more things than you would think. And it fucking pisses me off. And so, yeah, there are tons of things. The entirety of Lovecraft pisses me off. So someone which is a Greek play that we only have. I'm talking about the Seneca. We only have the Seneca translation, and we don't have the original play. Hippolytus in that. I mean, I actually quite like Phaedra because I like it because of Phaedra, because she feeds into a bunch of other Greek myths, and her voice isn't heard elsewhere. But that play is about how much women are the worst. From start to finish, Hippolytus opens it with a monologue about how women are the worst thing that's ever happened to any person on this planet, and they are disgusting and exorbitant.
After they were born.
Yeah, and obviously, after making Hippolytus, it was all over. And I mean, what happens in the play is that the goddesses curse him for being such a dick. But of course, how that curse works out is women are the worst to him. So there's this sort of recursive thing about how women are terrible, even if they're divine. The thing is, and I don't want to get into like these sort of categories where I just talk about women's issues and stuff, but like, misogyny is so fundamental that it is, you can't say, well, some people it informed their work and some people it didn't. It informed a lot, if not all, of literature written by men up until a certain point. It is pervasive, it is blood deep, and they don't even have to be as obvious as Hippolytus to be writing a play where all the way through, a woman is coming out on top and then just throw her down in the kitchen to look in front of your friends at the end with no commentary. Like, this is literature. It is also culture, and that goes for race, and it goes for class, and it goes for all of it. But I just get pissed off now. Like, that's what happens. I get pissed off and I write something in my life. That's my process.
Does this either cut you off from a lot of literature of the past, or does it in fact make that literature much more interesting to you?
I'm a big girl. No, it doesn't make me like I cut myself off. I can appreciate plenty of things and also say, well, that is just terrible. Those are terrible things to communicate in your work. I think in some sense it helps to try and see in my work what are the unexamined assumptions, because everybody has them. Nobody is perfect. Everybody exudes the nonsense of their culture. And so reading works that are otherwise beautiful sometimes helps me to examine myself. No, it doesn't cut me off. Like I said, I'm a classicist. My God, like classical misogyny is intense. But at the same time, does it make it more interesting? Well, not really. I mean, if it had something different in it, I think it would still be interesting.
Well, let me ask you, there are model works that you know, what would you set up as a better example of work that you can admire? Just as you don't like the faith, you say TV is something that...
Oh, I love TV, but that is an entire family of me talking about TV. And it's not why everybody else loves TV.
So it's that whole...
Oh, well, I mean, well, we can
Maybe we got sidetracked. We're jumping around.
Because I don't want to get into my Lovecraft rant, so. So I mean, I think what you were saying is like, if you're a big girl, I wrote an article I wrote a blog post about Lovecraft. It really annoyed people. I went in letters and found out that he wanted to kill black people for like chimpanzees and quote unquote stab quote unquote rat-faced Jews on subway. These were the guys that said no. And people would say, "Was that mean you're trying to ban him?" I said, "I have no powers to do anything. I can't come to all of your homes and collect his books." And I said, "I'm not even telling you not to. I'm just putting this out there, and now you may do with it as you wish. But If you ask me, people say, well, do you think any of that informs his work? Of course, I just don't. And that's why we're all here. We talk about all of these, we don't simply like, I think all of these things and I shut that part off in my brain, and this is going to be my writing brain. None of those things will seep into it. You know, it's not like the washer where you have the fabric softener. Sometimes it makes you don't want them to, it's going to mix. And so I said, of course you can. People have written entire works on finding his notions of xenophobia and all of this in his works, and even things he names as cats, right? His pet cats and whatever. It's not really hard. And so these things exist, and what do you do with them, except as you said, you kind of deal with them. I don't know that it makes it more interesting, it simply makes it what it is, right? And I can go back and find that everyone is as odious as Lovecraft. I said, I love Ray Bradbury, and I had some problems with things that Ray Bradbury said. And people were shocked. He said something, I said, yes, because that's what we do. We look at these works, and I could find things, or certain people would find things maybe objectionable in my work. As you said, always looking at what we're doing ourselves. So I mean, this to me, I guess it gets back to the heart of when we look at the past and read the past, right? I am not saying that anyone, any type of work should be censored from the past. I'm not saying I shut myself off. But if I was thinking with Lovecraft, and some people were asking, well, if someone doesn't read Lovecraft, aren't they cutting themselves off? And I said, if they want to. There's no like rule that says, no, 12th commandment, thou shalt read Lovecraft or else. Your choice, right? And I said, if a person decides that I don't want any of that in my life, that's their choice, right? That's simply their choice, and I'm not going to fault them for that. So I think when it goes back to like, I think of how what I study in the past is not what everyone else may want to study or be invested in. And so that's my long-winded way of saying, you know, what we decide to read about in the past is often our choice, but you know, let's be honest about it when we see it.
And having a context, I think, for all of this and seeing that there is a context is really important. That you don't just look at one part of it, then you look at the whole of it and see whether the whole is worth having to deal with.